Hey there. Let's go ahead and get back to it here. So, in the next chapter, we are taking a look at kind of the social lens of Unit 4 here. Last chapter, we covered the political look, seeing the Mexican-American War, Manifest Destiny, kind of how all that's panning out here. At the same time as this unit, and really the unit before, we're going to see a lot about how the social context behind the North, especially, is really shifting under our feet. So, let's get my timer out. Let's take a look. So, first off, here, we are taking a look at kind of the Second Great Awakening and a little bit about how the reform movements are going to be directly inspired by that. So we're looking at basically the causes, beliefs, and results of the Second Great Awakening, perhaps one of the most significant events in U.S. history that you've probably never heard of and probably never seen a movie about. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the actual meat and potatoes here. Praise Jesus. So, the actual Second Great Awakening here, it's going to be caused by a lot of different stuff. Like, really, a lot of the major shifts that we saw in the previous unit, they're on full display at this point. And as a result, what we are seeing is a lot of just culminations of the massive way of life that has shifted here. So, for example, we saw that in last unit, under the age of Andrew Jackson, the era of the common man, there's now a growing belief that, well, since any white man can vote regardless of how much property they have or don't have, there's a growing belief that people's voice matters. That if you speak your mind, someone will listen and someone will validate your opinion. So, more activism is happening as a result, as more and more people are starting to actually feel like what they have to say is significant. So, politically, that's a huge shift. We see that economically, there is that market revolution from the last unit as the North is starting to industrialize and commercialize. More and more part of the country is connected to capitalism. We see that the old ways of systems are no longer working. The yeoman farmer lifestyle is ever so slightly beginning to fade altogether at this point. And so more people have to get a job. They have to go get a wage. They have to earn wages. And if they don't, then they're on the streets. On top of that, the places people live are changing. There is now a major demographic shift as more people are starting to leave their old communities and starting to actually go to the major factory cities where they can hopefully get jobs because that's what you need these days. So old, long communities are drying up now. They've been around for a long time, but now they are succumbing to capitalism, which is really sad. A lot of people feel isolated, like they're just working for a wage and having nothing else to do with their lives. They feel lost and adrift, like the world doesn't really care about them. We see that intellectually now we've kind of gotten past the Enlightenment era rationalism. We are now moving into the romanticism of the Jackson era. People are individuals. They want to live their life on their own terms and with their own beliefs. They don't want to have to listen to anyone else's guiding lights here. They are entirely self-sufficient. And also, there's a growing belief, kind of mixed with that westward expansion here, that if you go out into the untamed frontier of nature, that you will be able to reclaim a little bit of your true destiny. You can find your new self out there, and you might even get a little bit closer to God. And more on that in a sec. On top of that, there's also a bunch of new people in America, as there's a huge wave of immigrants coming from Northwestern Europe, and that was our old immigrants right there. And that should be bolded because that is a term. I apologize. So basically, our old immigrants here, they are predominantly German and Irish. And of the two, there are more Irish than there are Germans. But on top of that, they're also, well, there are exceptions, but they are mostly Catholic. And so we see that that is a major shift here because, again, a lot of the Anglo-Americans at this point are Protestant. And so we see a lot of cultural and social differences here because the Catholics and the Protestants do not vibe well. Just ask your friends in Euro if you don't remember there. And so what we see is that there's going to be an immediate backlash where we start to see a rise of nativism. And it's basically going to manifest in a lot of different ways. Politically, it will start to look like there is going to be pushes against immigrants in the form of entire political parties, like the Know Nothing Party that will appear. But the other is that socially there will be a pushback towards what they see as an alcoholism culture here. There's a bunch of people drinking in the 1820s, especially. And so these new immigrants, they have no cultural bias against it. In fact, a lot of people are drinking at this point in age because one, it is cheap, two, it is widely available, and three, there's no real stigma yet. It isn't until these immigrants show up that the anti-alcohol stigma begins to appear, and we'll see how that manifests in our reform movements later. But just know that that is going to be a source of friction right there. These new immigrants, sorry, they are new to America, but they are called the old immigrants because there are new immigrants in Unit 6. More on that later. Anyhow, the idea here of nature being divine, that is also going to be manifested in a new philosophy of this era called transcendentalism. And basically, the belief here is on top of believing that nature is sacred and basically the way to understand the universe, they are also fiercely individualistic. They fully believe that you have to determine how to live your life based on your own sense of intuition. Like you have this like kind of GPS in your system that just tells you what your personal sense of right or wrong is. And you should follow wherever it leads you to live a moral life, even if that leads to jail. For example, we're going to see plenty of transcendentalists will get caught up in reform movements, and plenty will voice their opinions about things like the Mexican-American War. One notable example is a transcendentalist named Henry David Thoreau, and he believes that truly you must be willing to speak out and voice your opinion, even if it lands you in jail. Laws of man are temporary, but moral high ground is forever. And so the way he sees it is that he's going to speak out against a lot of other issues here. And other transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson will encourage civil disobedience against things like the Fugitive Slave Act. More on that later. All right. Lastly, we see that middle class women have been encouraged to leave the workforce here via the cult of domesticity here. Women are being reinforced with propaganda saying that an ideal woman is frail, that they are physically and mentally inferior to men, and that their job is not to go out and, sully their hands working at a job or doing politics or poetry. They should be in the house taking care of the domestic work because that is their entire separate sphere. They control the private sphere and therefore have a sacred job here as not only the housekeeper, but as the moral guide of the family. They are the angel of the house. And we'll see how that manifests a little bit later. So, all of this major whiplash that we just covered, all of that is going to cause the Second Great Awakening. And what we see, the actual Second Great Awakening is a Protestant religious revival. More people are feeling the holy light. They are going to church, and not just church, but they are going to these camp revivals in the woods and basically reaffirming their love of God and pledging to go back to church because they feel the Holy Ghost. And so, on that note, we see that this has a couple ways it manifests. One, this is largely going to be the work of Charles Grandison Finney right there, who is going to preach a much more romanticized version of the Bible. He's not focusing on scripture too much or even like memorizing doctrine. It's about you and making you feel something more than anything else. That Jackson era romanticism. He believes that by getting people to feel it's the best way to connect to them. And he's going to go all up and down that burned over district in New York where the Erie Canal runs through and cleanse it of sin as he goes. Convince people to go back to church. Convince them that it is our American job to make a perfect society as an example to the rest of the world. And the way that we can do that is by kind of taking the old stigma of, shaming people like in Unit 1 with Calvinism and the First Great Awakening and kind of blending it with the idea that you are individual and you have free will. Predestination is gone. The idea that you can actually earn your way into heaven is back on the table. You don't know if you're going to heaven or not, but it's up to you to earn that right. Salvation is available to all. And the way that we ensure that everyone gets saved is by making sure that we have communities that are free from sin. We want to make our communities better. If we do that, that is how we get Jesus to come back and start the rapture, which is the end of the world, but that's what Christians want. It's a whole thing. Okay. So anyhow, what we are seeing is that this is going to catch like wildfire. This burned over district causes all kinds of denominations to show up. Mormons are around, Adventists are around, Shakers, a bunch of other religious groups, and they are all going to believe in this idea of making society better. So, how does that actually manifest? Well, a lot of different ways. For one, there are going to be some people that are going to take this idea of making society better and they'll say we can do without the society part. And what I mean is that we're going to go make our own separate society where there's no problems in the first place. Boom, utopian communities are going to be around. And so we covered a lot of really weird examples in the class. Some of them are more bizarre than others, but basically all of these have the belief of trying to make a perfect society and basically just kind of create a society where they are ideal. The Shakers, they had everyone having religious property and sorry, a religious utopia where no one has property. My bad there. And we saw there's also no they're going to be celibate. And yeah, the Oneida community, they are going to focus on group marriage. And the way they saw it is therefore no one's ever lonely. Everyone feels the love of God because we're in one big holy family right there. And also the largest one was the Brook Farm community, which was actually not religious, but transcendentalist. So it's a little more of a philosophy movement. And they combined good thinking, intellectual pursuits with actual rigor, like shoveling manure. So even though it's the biggest one, it was appealing to, nerds. It's going to fall apart quickly. And then we have the Mormons, who you could argue are actually kind of the first all-American religion because they have a whole new prophet figure. Jesus is not the main guy. It is Joseph Smith, who is going to be an American. He even ran for president in 1844. And so we see they're going to rationalize Christianity and they're going to say that they're making it better, but also they are going to encourage polygamy. And so that's going to lead to persecution where they're going to be forced out of New York, that burned over district, into Illinois, and then eventually all the way out to Utah, where they can hopefully live in peace. Now, most people are not going to join these utopian communities here. What they'll instead will see is that most people want to just take their existing life and just make it a little bit better. And so all these reform movements are all caused by the Second Great Awakening to some extent. Um, for example, Horace Mann, he's going to be the champion of public education from Massachusetts. Kind of go back to the Puritan idea from Unit 1 that education is important to read the Bible. We see that he's going to get the most direct success in his movement, at least in this time frame up to the 1840s, because we see that he's going to start encouraging people to pass state laws to allow for free public education, at least to the elementary school level. And it's going to be a huge deal because it means that not only are more people than ever getting a free education and therefore better intellectual prospects, but it's also going to kind of indoctrinate kids to be ideal factory workers, like conditioning them for the conditions of a factory job. Woohoo! So, anyhow, that was very successful. But this religious idea of repentance is also available in the other reform movements. For example, prison reform, the Auburn system of the 1820s. We see that the belief here is that prisoners are not just horrible, irredeemable people. They can be saved if they work hard. We're going to make them work hard all day by, breaking rocks and stuff, and they'll be solitary confinement all night. They can't talk for any of this, but they're going to be thinking about their sins, and therefore they will one day see the light of God. Therefore, prisons are now known as penitentiaries, as someone who kneels before God. What about people who shouldn't be in prison? Mentally ill people. Before this, they were often just thrown in prison because of their tendencies to be a little bit hard to be around, especially someone who's more on the violent side. A woman named Dorothea Dix is going to take this religious idea here and create special institutions where mentally ill people can actually receive training and coping skills. The idea here is that they can be housed here and one day re-enter society as a fully functional member. Now, a lot of it is, a far cry from what we have now. They're called asylums or even lunatic hospitals, and their training was often involving, just reciting Bible verses. But it sets up the idea here that the mentally ill are not criminals. And it's another idea here that we are finding more souls for God to save and making our communities better in the process. And lastly, we see that the alcoholism causes people to sin. It's going to cause workplace injuries or early deaths and invalid families. So the American Temperance Society shows up and they basically encourage people to stop drinking. And we'll see that little by, slowly but surely, this movement becomes a national movement and drinking does go down drastically, at least among the Protestants. These old immigrants, these Catholics, there's no religious stigma, so it's another source of divide and nativism. All right, the last bit to get through here, the anti-slavery movements. This is one of the two really big examples here of Second Great Awakening ideals here. And the way that manifests is through militant abolitionism. Slavery is a sin and should be stopped now. That's the belief here. And we see there's no more kind of beating around the bush here with the idea of, some gradual emancipation law or like relocating them to Liberia, like in Unit 3. No, end slavery now, because otherwise you're a sinner and you're going to hell. And the way we see that is through the works of William Lloyd Garrison, our liberator here, who started up that famous pamphlet, The Liberator, in 1831. He starts up the American Anti-Slavery Society, and by releasing this editorial every week, by having pamphlets depicting slavery in graphic detail or telling personal stories, we see that they are trying to sway the minds of the people through moral suasion. And that's important to remember. The militant abolitionists, despite the word militant in the name, they are pacifists. And this unit, they are focused on winning people's minds and hearts, not by forcing them to do this. And so we will see that they are going to partner with a lot of former enslaved people themselves. One notable one, Frederick Douglass, who, if his story is to be believed, is a man who managed to escape from slavery. He managed to teach himself how to read, and he tells his story, and it basically is a eloquent, fascinating person who will talk with anyone to just show the horrors of being a slave. And so we also see that, this also includes other people like Harriet Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom's Cabin, more on that in Unit 5, but also even many women. And for example, Sojourner Truth is a woman who is going to basically use these reform movements to also criticize um, the role that women have with the cult of domesticity, basically saying that any arguments that say men are superior are kind of unfounded, especially when they're religious based. Using that famous example there, where did Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with it. She's my favorite. I like her. Um, so anyhow, on that same note, these movements, what they're going to result in is that the North is no longer silent about these issues here. And so we'll see how that manifests later. But lastly, the idea here, finally, women's rights. Now, we saw that there are many women who, as the angel of the house, are the actual reformers that we're talking about here, the kind of rank and file of a lot of these reform movements, especially temperance, are going to be a lot of women. But there is sexism involved still. There is plenty of a lot of ideas here, like the women's rights movement here involving abolition. There was a conference in London that many prominent women were denied entrance to because of the fact that they were women, just the whole separate spheres idea. And so what we see is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and another reformer named Lucretia Mott, think of the fruit snacks, Lucretia Mott, they're going to form their own convention, the Seneca Falls Convention here. And the belief here is that they're going to create an organization that is going to get a push for women's right to vote. That is their big divine line here. And with it kind of starts the first wave of feminism as we know it. That is the dividing goal right here, the right to vote. And with it, there's some implied goals here, like the ability to speak publicly, the ability to advocate for themselves, determine their own lives, go to work, get an education, basically have much greater autonomy over their own lives, which they don't get under the current cult of domesticity. They don't want the separate spheres. And so many supporters will say this is the best way for women to truly experience freedom in their lives, to fight for an actual chance to express themselves in any way that they want. The vote would represent that, the same way it represented that idea for Jacksonian democracy. Meanwhile, many critics are diehard supporters of the cult of domesticity. So naturally, many men are going to be in that boat. But at the same time, there are plenty of other women who are also going to support the idea of they like their separate sphere. They like the idea that they have this one area that's reserved for them and their specialties that men can't touch. So this movement, even though it is going to be kind of hand in hand with the abolition movement at this point in time, it's going to be a lot tougher of a sell. And in truth, women do not really get the right to vote until much later, 55 years after slavery is gone. And it takes a lot more convincing. Even though there was a literal civil war over abolition, women, their plight is seen as no big deal because the shackles are invisible. All right. So women like Susan B. Anthony will be fighting for this until pretty much the day they die. And it won't get passed until 1920. All right. So anyhow, all these reform movements, they are all examples of this new idea of reforming our community to make sure everyone gets saved for the Second Great Awakening here. And when we wrap up here, we'll take a look at one last chapter. It'll go very quick about the society of the South and how it relates to slavery. All right. If you got any questions, feel free to hit us up on Remind. And peace out, folks. Thanks for listening.